Hi everyone. Today we'll be presenting to you about self-cleaning surfaces. My name's Evan and I'll be presenting with Ben, Grace, and Sherry. So what are self-cleaning surfaces? These are surfaces that have inherent characteristics to allow the removal of foreign debris. This is also commonly referred to as the lotus effect. And in this presentation, we'll mainly focus on superhydrophobic surfaces. However, self-cleaning can be attained using superhydrophilic surfaces and photocatalytic processes. Some applications for self-cleaning surfaces include things such as windows, eyeglasses, windshields, paints, and solar panels. Of particular interest are solar panels. Any dust on these surfaces tends to inhibit the conversion of UV to electrical energy, and the microstructures typically used to do so also fundamentally improve the UV absorption of the panel. By using self-cleaning surfaces, we also reduce traditional cleaning. This lowers the cost of cleaning and also the resulting surface damage like scratches. And in the case of solar panels, this can increase their efficiency and service life. So as we mentioned on the last slide, the properties of the surface are primarily responsible for the action of self-cleaning. To remove the particle, a droplet must move over it and absorb it into itself. With this, surface wettability is key. As we have learnt in class, wettability is determined by the balance between adhesive and cohesive forces. These together determine the contact angle. A high contact angle has a stronger cohesive force than adhesive force. As a whole, these contact angles are determined by the surface energy, roughness, and cleanliness. Surfaces with low surface energy will have higher contact angles, lowering the friction between the droplet and the surface, allowing greater mobility. To further reduce the adhesion forces, we have seen how this can be accomplished through surfaces with microtextures. We have also seen how this structure greatly affects the contact angle of the droplet, and to allow access to the favorable Cassie-Baxter straight, this structure must be carefully developed. By increasing the solid surface fraction, the contact angle can be increased. And from this, we can see that superhydrophobic surfaces are preferred to allow droplet mobility.
So the small contact angle that superhydrophobic surfaces create allows droplets to easily slide or roll across the surface. When they do this, as you can see in the diagram, they contact dust particles, which are absorbed into the droplet, and the droplet carries them away. The process by which the particles are removed from the surface has to do with cloaking of the particle by the droplet. When the particles are cloaked, they can be picked up by the droplet and they mix with the internal fluid. The forces involved with particle removal are explained in more detail later in this video, but for now we'll focus on the first thing you need to have for self-cleaning to occur, which is droplet mobility. In general, the force which causes droplets to move on a surface is gravity. There are some other strategies. For example, you can rotate a surface and you can make use of centripetal forces, but usually motion is driven by mg sine delta, as you can see in the diagram here. And there are two main forces which counteract droplet movement, which are the force of adhesion and the shear force, which you can also see here. These equations show how the force of adhesion and the shear force are calculated and which factors will affect each term. First, let's look at the force of adhesion, which is a function of the liquid surface energy, the droplet diameter prior to deformation, the solid surface fraction, and the contact angle hysteresis. Minimizing the force of adhesion means that the droplets will detach more easily and begin rolling or sliding, which is beneficial for a self-cleaning surface. There are two main things we'd like to control from a surface engineering perspective to achieve this: the solid surface fraction and the contact angle hysteresis. For superhydrophobic surfaces, these terms are obviously low, which is why they perform very well. The force on the droplet also has to overcome the shear force acting opposite its movement. This term is a function of the viscosity, contact area of the droplet, and the shear strain rate. Since the strain rate is zero at rest, it only comes into play after the droplet begins moving. From the perspective of a surface engineer, if we'd like to facilitate droplet movement, which we do, then a low contact area is important here too. A superhydrophobic surface lets us minimize both the force of adhesion and the shear force so we get maximum droplet movement. So how much force do we need to overcome the resistances and get the droplets to start moving? Well, if we're using a superhydrophobic surface, it really doesn't take much. These charts show the velocity of two different sizes of water droplets starting from rest and rolling down a surface under different conditions. The surfaces are arranged at either a 1-degree angle or a 10-degree angle, and they're either totally clean or dusty. We can see that the larger droplet accelerates more quickly, but reaches a similar top speed, so it doesn't appear that the size of the droplet plays a huge role. The condition of the surface does seem to, though, since we can see that the dusty surfaces do slow down the droplets. The red lines are profiles from the 1-degree slope, which shows why superhydrophobic surfaces are so good in this application. Even with a 1-degree tilt, droplets can move with about half the velocity of a 10-degree slope, so it's very easy to keep the droplets moving and for self-cleaning to occur.
Now that we've talked about surface properties and droplet mobility, let's move on to the very particle we want to remove. These particles can vary in size, shape, and surface energy, and are usually soluble particles like alkaline metals or insoluble compounds like silica or calcite. Their geometry may have round corners, sharp edges, or even be flake-like. These features tend to change significantly with the size of these particles. However, as the size decreases, they tend to become more spherical in shape. These particles can vary in size from nanometers all the way to 20 micrometers. Anything smaller than 1 micrometer tends to attach itself to other particles. And as seen in the graph to the right, the average size of these particles can be assumed to be about 1.2 micrometers.
Particles of dirt, dust, bacteria, and other debris stick to hard surfaces. These particles stick to the surfaces by different forces of adhesion. The van der Waals force is the most common force. It is a force between any two molecules or atoms which attracts them to each other. In areas of high humidity, small amounts of water vapor can condense around a particle, and the capillary forces hold the particle to the surface. Static electricity tends to be higher on solid surfaces at lower humidity, and as static electricity can be either attractive or repulsive, when both van der Waals and electrostatic forces are present, the particle will stick to the surface if the sum of the two forces is positive. The overall force of adhesion is lowered as the surface roughness increases. Therefore, nanotextured surfaces are better for self-cleaning purposes. One study found that for a hydrophobic nanotextured surface, 98% of particles could be removed, whereas only 81% of particles were removed on a hydrophobic smooth surface. A dust particle on a hard surface is subject to the adhesion forces as discussed in the previous slide. As a particle reaches the droplet, it is subject to a water particle air tension force at the advancing line. This is the force that removes the particle from the surface and brings it into the droplet. If the particle is not immediately removed, then the droplet rolls completely over the particle. It is again subject to just the force of adhesion on the surface. Once reached by the receding line, the particle is again subject to the tension force. If the water particle air tension force is greater than the force of adhesion, the particle will be removed from the surface. For hydrophobic materials, the particle is removed at the receding line, and for hydrophilic materials, the particle will be removed at the advancing line. Because hydrophilic surfaces remove particles at the advancing line, if the particle remains stuck to the surface, water from the droplet's receding line will remain. This causes a residual layer that is not observed with hydrophobic surfaces. So let's take a closer look at the particle along the receding edge of a droplet on a superhydrophobic surface. As we covered last slide, the line tension force is what brings the particle into the droplet or leaves it on the surface. Unfortunately, these particles can bend the liquid-air interface, adding complexity to the analysis. Thankfully, the force can be calculated as determined by this formula seen here. The water coverage angle is the angle made at the top contact point between the particle and droplet. The water contact angle is the angle made at the bottom of the particle with the droplet. With both considered, the net line force can be calculated to determine if the particle will be lifted off the surface. If the water coverage angle is greater than the water contact angle, then the particle is forced into the droplet. If they are equivalent or the water contact angle exceeds the water coverage angle, then the particle is pushed towards the air. If we consider the particle is to be against a superhydrophobic surface, The water contact angle is going to be around 0 degrees, and as the receding line moves, the water coverage angle increases somewhat independently from the water contact angle. From the sign product in this formula, this will result in a negative number, showing that the particle will be pulled into the droplet. The following questions are questions that you should be able to answer after watching our presentation. Please let us know if you have any additional questions that we can answer for you, and contact us if you need. Thank you.